Good day. The last 24 hours have been very quiet on the Ukrainian battlefronts. There's not been very much information of any further Ukrainian advances. The Ukrainians having advanced in land, territory, I should say territory largely abandoned by the Russians. They didn't fight for every, the Ukrainians didn't have to fight for every millimeter or inch of it. The Russians regrouped their forces and pulled back from the Ingulets River, at least in some places, and ceded a lot of ground to the Ukrainians. Anyway, so far the Ukrainians have not advanced beyond that new line that the Russians have created. And of course, if you listen to what Russian officials in places like Kherson are saying, the front lines are stable and that they're unlikely to be shifted further in Kherson region. Well, we'll see. And elsewhere in the Kharkiv, northern Donbass regions, Ukraine has been making attempts at offensives, but so far as I can see, and of course, maybe I'm not the best judge of these things, not having, as I said, ever served in any military, but so far as I can see, they haven't actually been achieving very much ever since Liman itself was captured about a week ago. Indeed, and rather surprisingly, there's actually been a small Russian counterattack in this area, or to be more precise, it was a counterattack staged by one of the units of the former Liman garrison. So we're talking about an attack staged by a few hundred men at most, and it seems to have recaptured a village. An inconsequential event, perhaps, but anyway, no doubt it's been a fillip for morale. What I think is interesting and important is that it's becoming increasingly clear, and there's now a accumulation of information from lots of sources, all corroborating this, including some Western sources. Scott Ritter discussed this, by the way, in a program with Garland Nixon the other day. What one can say is that it seems that in order to maintain the momentum of these offensives, Ukraine is having to strip its forces from all sorts of areas of Ukraine. For example, it seems that Ukrainian forces in the Chernigov region in northern Ukraine, an area where the Russians made important advances back in February and March, those Ukrainian forces have been pulled away from the Chernigov region, leaving that whole area open to any Russian attack were any such attack to take place. And it's been suggested that if the Russians were to send forces into Ukraine from in that area, hundreds of kilometers of territory would probably rapidly fall under their control. Whether that's what the Russians will do, I'm not going to try and speculate. I don't know their plans. And I've also heard reports that Ukraine has actually pulled pretty much the entire garrison of Odessa and thrown it into the meat grinder at Kherson, as it comes under relentless pressure now from its Western allies to push on with this offensive towards Kherson and to try to capture Kherson over the next few days or weeks. Now, I'm going to go back to that article in the Financial Times, which I read, and it suggested that the absolute end point at which Kherson could be captured by the Ukrainians is mid-November. I'm not quite sure how that is worked out. But if one is talking about climate conditions, about weather, about the ground getting soft and boggy, which is what this article, this in the Financial Times yesterday, was mainly about, and how that makes further advances increasingly difficult and ultimately impossible for Ukrainian armor. Well, mid-November is far too late. We are probably now just days away from that point, and the evidence is that we're getting closer to that point already, with heavier rains, more clouds, fog, and the ground starting to turn soft. So if forces are really being pulled from Odessa and places like Chernigov to maintain the pace of these offensives, then I have to say it does seem as if Ukraine and its Western backers are taking what are beginning to look like very big risks. Now, I'm sure that the Russians are aware of this. I don't know what the Russians are thinking about this, whether they are planning to exploit these gaps in the front lines, whether they are content to let the Ukrainians spend themselves in more offensives. I hope and presume, from a Russian point of view, that if they are pursuing the latter tactic of letting the Ukrainians wither themselves away by these attacks, then I presume that the Russians are confident that they can hold on in all the places that really matter to them, Kherson City being, of course, one. Anyway, that's where we are on the battlefields. I can't really say much more about them at the moment. No doubt there will be more news over the next couple of hours. Conceivably, as so often happens now, by the time this program is published, you will have a completely different situation on the battlefields. There's one final observation, however, I am going to make, and that is that one area where Ukraine has also apparently pulled troops in order to sustain these offensives, withdrawn troops to sustain these offensives, is the key battlefields of central Donbass, Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And I'm now starting to get more and more reports. They're not always easy to decipher, but we're starting to hear some murmurings that Bakhmut itself might be very close to falling now. It might be that the final collapse in Bakhmut might be just days away. Ukrainian collapse in Bakhmut might be just days away. And that the Ukrainian grouping in Avdiivka, from where much of the shelling of Donetsk city has been taking place, that might be just days away too. Well, all I will say about that is this. Again, I can't confirm one way or the other whether that is really so. But if it is, if Bakhmut falls and Avdiivka falls, and assuming that Ukraine doesn't manage to capture Kherson over the next few weeks, next week or 10 days or so, and that the offensive there, which has been conducted in the face of horrific losses, and that the offensive there gets bogged down, well, then it seems to me that Ukraine has gained a lot of ground, but it will have lost the most important battle. Because to be straightforward about this, Bakhmut matters much more than any of these places, certainly more than Izium, more than Liman, and more than this probably increasingly swampy area of steppe land that the Ukrainians now occupy in northern Kherson region. Of course, all of this is predicated on the assumption that, one, the Russians are indeed close to capturing Bakhmut city and encircling Avdiivka, and secondly, that the Ukrainians aren't able to break through in Kherson region and take Kherson city. But, that all remains to be seen. Now, let's go then to the big news. And the big news, and one of the reasons why we know it's big news, is because in Britain, the media here has decided that it won't talk about it, though, apart from the Financial Times, I should say. But in the US, it's a big story, and it's news that has enraged the Biden administration. And that is this decision by OPEC Plus to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. And already we're starting to see oil prices harden. The White House, the US government, the US administration, the Biden administration has taken this decision incredibly badly. They've accused Saudi Arabia of siding with Russia, and there's increasing talk in some parts of the media about the long US-Saudi alliance being on the verge of final collapse. Well, I'm not going to argue with much of that. I mean, at some level, one has to say that the Saudis, through their decisions, have indeed sided with Russia. After all, it was the case that just a few weeks ago, Biden went to Saudi Arabia. He kissed MBS's hand. He seemed to be begging the Saudis to increase oil production, to lower prices, to help him, Biden, with the November midterms and all that. So it's not surprising that the US is bitter about this decision. And it's not surprising. There's some truth, let's say, to the allegation that the Saudis have been acting more favorably to the Russians than to the US in making this move. But I think a few points do need to be made, and they do need to be made clear. I read a piece in the Daily Telegraph which said that the Russians had been lobbying the Saudis to cut oil production. Now, to my certain knowledge, this is wrong. The Saudis have been mulling a cut in oil production for some time, and they've been signalling it for quite a long time. And the previous oil production cut, which happened a few weeks ago, it's actually known that the Russians at that time opposed it. They opposed it because Russia was exporting as much oil as it possibly could, and it didn't want to cut production at that time, though it went along with the Saudi proposal. There's no doubt at all to my mind that this decision has been made by the Saudi government. Obviously, MBS is the major decision maker. He's now Saudi Arabia's prime minister. He's the undisputed leader of the country. But I am sure that on a decision of this kind, he will have consulted widely within the Saudi elite. He doesn't come across to me as being quite the fiery, impulsive, headstrong young man that he was when he first emerged in Saudi politics back in 2014 or 15 or whenever it was. So he's sort of settled down, and my own sense is that this is a decision which the entire Saudi establishment is in agreement about. So why have the Saudis done it? Well, I think they've done it for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think that they are worried about the way in which the United States has been trying to push down the oil price. It's been trying to push down the oil price by releasing oil from the US Strategic Reserve, which has been pushed down to perhaps dangerously low levels, to levels last seen in 1984, just after, by the way, the second big oil crisis of the post-war era, the first one being in 1973, then there was a second one in 1982, in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution, and Of course, the US in those days had only created its petroleum reserve relatively recently. So the administration has been releasing large amounts of oil to try to depress oil prices from the US reserves, and that can't have pleased the Saudis very much because it's targeting it an attempt to damp down the price of their product. And the United States has also been talking to other oil consumers to get them to simultaneously release oil from their reserves as well. It's been talking to India. It's even been talking to China to get the Chinese to do that. And some countries have done this, others have not. Generally speaking, most have not, or at least not to anything like the extent that the administration would have wanted. So it's been trying to depress prices in that way. And the third thing that's been happening, and this isn't perhaps so much the administration, the third thing that's been happening is that the Federal Reserve Board in the United States and other Western central banks have gradually been increasing interest rates, and supposedly, allegedly, this is intended to try to reduce inflation. And when central banks talk about inflation, in the current context, of course, what they mean to a great extent is energy price inflation. In other words, what they're trying to do is to trigger a slowdown in the Western economies, perhaps even a recession in the Western economies, perhaps even a severe recession in the Western economies, in order to reduce oil prices. And again, it's not obvious why the Saudis would be happy with that. And last but not least, there is this crazy idea which the United States hatched, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, hatched, which is this idea of capping the price, the globally traded price of Russian oil. So the idea is Russia can sell its oil, Russia should continue to sell its oil, but sell its oil at the price the United States and its allies decide. Now, obviously, the Russians are very unhappy about that, and they made it very clear that they will not cooperate with that idea. And other oil importers, China, India, Turkey, have said the same, apparently. But from a Saudi point of view, this is a particularly dangerous scheme because, of course, if the United States is able to control any part of the oil price using its sanctions mechanism, it can one day do that. It can one day control or try to control globally the entire oil price in the same way. And that's not something that the Saudis would want to see at all. From a Saudi point of view, and I've said this in several programs now, it is Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus with Russia, the oil producers, who have responsibility for deciding what the oil price is. This oil price cap idea, from a Saudi point of view, is anathema. It is a direct attack on the industry, the trade in that commodity upon which Saudi Arabia itself depends. So that's hardened Saudi feelings about all of this. But there's been a further factor, and it's one that's been pointed out by the Saudi oil minister, which is that because of the various sanctions wars that the West has been engaging in, because of the food crisis, there's been a general increase in global inflation. Prices globally of commodities have been rising. Because of these various steps that the Biden administration has been doing to try to tamp down the oil price, its growth has actually been less than the overall price rise in prices. So whilst the Saudis are making more money from the oil that they're selling, the goods that they buy have been getting more expensive at a faster rate. Now, I have to say, I don't think that is enough to extinguish for Saudi Arabia the overall benefit from the oil price increase. But one can see why people in Saudi Arabia are saying to each other, why should we make sacrifices to help the United States? And as the Saudi oil minister made absolutely crystal clear, this is not about helping Russia, it's about keeping the oil price, as he would say, stable. In other words, at a level that Saudi Arabia likes and is comfortable with. If that helps Russia, well, so be it. The Saudis are acting in their own interests. Now, this story is in fact very indicative of the way in which the United States has come to think about things. It assumes that everybody has some kind of a duty to help the United States when the United States finds itself in trouble. And in the case of the current administration, it even goes further than that. It assumes that everybody has a duty to help the administration when it gets itself into trouble. And it's fascinating how the administration, the Biden administration, in deciding on its various energy policies and its sanctions war against Russia, disregarded the concerns and the feelings of the country, Saudi Arabia, that has arguably been its most loyal ally for most of the last 70 years in the Arab world and even perhaps in the greater Middle East. I say that, I know there's been lots of Americans who will feel, with some cause, that Saudi Arabia has been an increasingly difficult ally for many years, going all the way back to the events of 2001, September 2001, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. So that's where we are at the moment with this oil thing. Now, what's it going to mean? Well, it's going to mean higher oil prices. And the other factor that's going to push oil prices higher is the fact that there's now growing evidence that the Chinese economy is going to start reflating soon, which means that oil prices are going to start rising. And that's also inevitably going to put greater pressure on prices as well. And all of this coming, of course, on top of the energy problems, the gathering energy crisis in the United States as well. In Europe as well. And here, there's been a very interesting development because the German government has responded to the huge increase in energy costs in Germany by doing exactly the same thing that the Liz Truss quasi-Quarteng government has been doing in Britain. It's announced a package costing 200 billion euros to try to essentially cap household fuel bills. So households will continue to receive their fuel bills at current prices. Higher prices won't be factored in. The government instead will pay them. They will importantly not be paying, as I understand it, the cost of energy to business and industry consumers. And this is 200 billion euros that is going to be spent on this project. Essentially, similar amounts to the sort of 130, 150 billion pounds that the British government is spending on its particular plan. Now, this has already caused a great deal of anger within the European Union. Various European states are complaining. Spain is complaining. I understand France isn't happy. I understand Italy isn't happy. That this move by Germany violates the principle of the European single market. It means that energy costs for some consumers in Europe are going to be lower, are going to be kept artificially lower than costs elsewhere, and there's concerns that this is going to destabilize energy markets in Europe because it will keep energy consumption in Germany high, and that will have to work through energy, through gas being sucked into Germany from elsewhere in Europe. So there's already complaints about this from some of Germany's European friends, or erstwhile friends. And of course, the other problem with it is that it's an unsustainable policy anyway. It's one that's more likely to cause fuel and energy shortages, if not in Germany, then certainly in Europe. But the financial cost is simply impossible. Attempting to resolve problems of this nature by, in effect, abolishing the price mechanism is, in my opinion, completely misguided and completely wrong. And I'm going to say straight away that doing it, in my opinion, is more likely than not going to exacerbate energy shortages in Europe. If you want to resolve energy problems, what a government should be doing is ensuring smooth supply, not cutting off supply and at the same time sustaining demand. I mean, that is an illogical policy to follow. But of course, ensuring smooth supply would mean talking to the Russians, would mean trying to get pipeline gas from Russia flowing to Europe again. And that's something that Germany, of course, with its current government, is not able politically to do. So we see how the sanctions war is becoming increasingly illogical and is contradicting basic, fundamental, very straightforward principles of economics which any economist of whatever school understands. But now we have further twists to this because Robert Habeck, the man who is supposed to be in overall charge of Germany's economy, Germany's economics minister, a green politician, but also Germany's vice chancellor, has now come out and started complaining angrily about the prohibitively high cost that the Americans are charging for the liquefied natural gas that they're supplying to Germany. Now, again, I come back to my earlier point about the extraordinary sense of entitlement that some people in the US have, and the Biden administration certainly has, in assuming that when the United States gets into trouble, everyone else must rush to its rescue. I feel about Habeck in exactly the same way. What he is asking is that the Americans supply gas to Germany, liquefied natural gas to Germany, not at a market price, but at the price he wants. He wants, in other words, a say, more than just a say, he wants to be in a position to dictate American prices for LNG. And here we see perhaps a curious paradox, because in a kind of a way, that's what the European Union and the G7 are trying to do when they're trying to dictate the price of Russian gas. They're trying to impose a non-market price, a non-commercial price, Russian oil, a non-commercial price for Russian oil. They seem to be wanting to do the same thing. Habeck seems to be wanting to do the same thing with US LNG, except, of course, he's not going to be able to do it. But anyway, one way or the other, it does show how disastrously this whole economic war has been mismanaged. Now, I come back to what I've been saying in various programs. When you have comments like those that President Biden and his officials have been making about this decision by Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus to cut production, when you see comments like the ones that Robert Habeck has been making about the Americans overcharging for LNG, when you see the Truss Kwarteng government blaming the markets for the problems that their mini-budget, their ill-starred mini-budget experienced, well, what it tells you is that these people have no plan. They have no idea of what to do in this situation. I say no idea. I mean no economic plan. Maybe they have other plans. I've been getting lots of people contacting me, suggesting that perhaps in response to this OPEC Plus decision, the United States might consider fomenting some kind of coup or color revolution in Saudi Arabia, for example. Well, maybe they are thinking about that. It wouldn't surprise me if they were. And the United States has lots of contacts and connections in Saudi Arabia, so maybe that is what they're going to do. All I would say is that would be piling folly upon folly. First of all, if there was a coup attempt in Saudi Arabia and it failed, which I think is most likely, then of course that will confirm MBS's belief that the United States is no longer a friendly power, it has become a hostile power. And at that point, the US-Saudi alliance, which is already looking fragile, would look more fragile still. And one can see how at that point the Saudis might want to press forward with their already announced intentions of joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also perhaps the BRICS, and also perhaps joining in this project that the BRICS are working on and are known to be working on to set up a reserve currency alternative to the dollar. And given that the current reserve currency status of the dollar depends heavily on the fact that the Saudis back in the 1970s agreed that the price of dollars should be determined in the price of oil should be determined in dollars, and that sales of oil should be internationally traded in dollars, something which, given that oil is the world's most widely traded commodity, meant that every country in the world had to hold dollars in order to buy oil. Given that that is a major central plank of the dollar's reserve status, one can see how an attempted coup in Saudi Arabia, which failed, might have a whole succession of consequences which might not be good for the dollar and might not ultimately be good for the United States itself. Well, that would be if the coup failed. What if it succeeded? Well, that begs the question of whether whatever coup government the United States imposed on Saudi Arabia possessed legitimacy and was able to establish control. Perhaps it would, but what if it didn't? What if some people in Saudi Arabia resented the fact that the United States was coming along and shuffling around royals like cards in a pack and deciding which would be at the top of the pack and which not? What if that were to lead to a political crisis within Saudi Arabia? What if protests began to take hold? After all, we don't know very much about the internal situation in Saudi Arabia, but one gets the impression that there are large parts of the country which, let's put it like this, are not entirely happy with the current situation. What if there was a general loss of control? What if Saudi Arabia started to become increasingly unstable? What, in fact, if Saudi Arabia began to look like post-Saddam Hussein Iraq? Well, the implications for the oil price would be enormous, obviously, but I can easily see how that might set in train a whole lot of other problems with Islamist groups and who knows what spreading across the Middle East in ways that might not be to the benefit of the United States or its European allies. It might create all kinds of problems. It might result in a new government or in new political forces which, for example, are hostile to the United States' ally Israel in the Middle East at a time when the United States has been trying to win over more and more Arab states to forge good relations with Israel. I think it's a very dangerous plan. I think it's one that could easily go wrong if that is the plan. Anyway, we'll see. The point is, whether or not the United States has such a plan, I don't know. I can't comment. But what I will say about it is this. There's been a great deal of discussion about whether the military operation in Ukraine that the Russians launched back in February has gone according to their plans. And I would say it clearly hasn't. It seems to me that when the Russians went into Ukraine, when Putin declared the special military operation in Ukraine back in February, it seems to me that his clear intention was, yes, to secure the independence of the two Donbass republics, but also to sign off on an agreement with President Zelensky's government in Kiev and to achieve neutral status and demilitarization of Ukraine. That was, I think, Putin's original plan. And he came very close to achieving it, or at least he came to the point where he seemed about to achieve it at that meeting in Istanbul on the 29th of March, when it seemed as if a peace agreement was on the table. But as we know, it never really happened. And it seems to me that the Russians have not been entirely sure until fairly recently what to do, but they've now decided that they're going to have to go all out sooner or later in Ukraine, and that must be what that mobilization is ultimately about, as well as the recognition of the independence, rather the annexation of these four regions whose independence the Russians had previously recognized. So clearly things have not turned out exactly as the Russians had expected, though it does seem that very slowly, very gradually, they're adapting to that. But it seems to me equally true, perhaps even more importantly true, that the Western economic war against Russia has failed. And it's failed in a way that is now creating not just severe damage to Western economies and we could see that already by midsummer, but is now at risk of evolving into something far worse, into an extremely deep and severe crisis. And whilst the Russians do seem to be working out some kind of a plan on how they're going to deal with the military problems in Ukraine, there's no sign yet of anything that looks like a plan from the West about how to deal with these economic problems. In my opinion, it's an absolute no-brainer. I mean, I think that what the West needs to do, I've been saying this for months, is that they should work to try and sort out these problems with the Russians. Now, I don't mean by that a reconciliation with the Putin government in Moscow is in order or is even achievable. I think what is needed is some kind of a ceasefire, allow the gas to flow from Russia to Europe, do away with most of these sanctions, and then perhaps agree with the Russians that there should be a phased process over perhaps 5-10 years, whereby both the Russians redirect their energy flows eastwards and the West looks for its energy solutions in some other way than with Russian gas. It would still be a bad deal, in my opinion, but it would be a lot better than what we're seeing now. That, it seems to me, is the obvious plan. And I can't see how that can be done without, at the same time, some kind of a settlement of the crisis in Ukraine. And I've talked about that many times. I'm still firmly convinced that there are no successful military outcomes to this war for Ukraine, that Ukraine is now throwing away vast numbers of men and machines in offensives that will only provide it with ephemeral gains, which it will eventually lose, and that the war will end with Ukraine being in a far worse position than it would have been in March, or than it would have been now if it were to seek peace now, and perhaps might not even exist at all. So those are my well-known, well-stated views. It seems to me that with every day that passes, with every twist in the economic knife, with every loss that we see in Ukraine, the position is moving ever further in that kind of direction. But, of course, in the West, we don't get any of that. We get instead news about Ukrainian victories, which are making some members of the media dizzy with success, as I can see, Western media very dizzy with success. And we see a general inability to wrestle with the economic problems. Now, I repeat again what I said at the start of this discussion about the oil issue. It's very striking how the British media, apart from the Financial Times, which is after all a business newspaper, has essentially ignored the OPEC plus price cut and its implications. Well, ignoring something doesn't make it go away. And it does, I have to say, remind me a little of the practices in some authoritarian states where disasters never happened because, of course, they were never reported until, of course, they became overwhelming and could no longer be denied. I would say that in Russia, on the military things, on the military setbacks that the Russian military has suffered, there is agonizing discussion, not just on Russian alternative media, but even on Russian mainstream media. There's been lots of debates and discussions about what's gone wrong, lots of criticisms of the defense ministry. It's not as if this has been brushed under the carpet there. If we go on brushing bad economic news under the carpet and pretending that it's not connected to our war, this economic war we're waging against Russia at the moment, then obviously our chances of finding a solution to this problem become smaller still. Well, that's my program for today. As I said, little exciting news from the battlefields. So I've focused perhaps, I don't think appropriately, on the energy issues. And no doubt there'll be more on the military side of things by the time, as I said, this video goes up. And certainly there'll be more from me soon. So that's me for today. More from me soon, as I said. Remember, you can find me on other platforms. You can find the Duran on other platforms, on Locals, on Rumble, on Odyssey, on BitChute, and on Telegram. And remember that exclusively on Locals, every Wednesday, at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time, I do a live stream. I had one yesterday, and it was extremely successful, if I may say. And I do endeavour to ask all the questions, if not during the live stream itself, in follow-up programs. And also, of course, if you want to support our work, you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And in the meantime, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Thank you, and see you soon.